If you're as good at predicting things as this guy is, then you'll already know which unit we're talking about today. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're continuing our focus on the Ultramarines characters with Chief Librarian Tigurius. We'll take a look at his datasheet, any potential combos we can see, and how I would go about using him on the battlefield. He has recently been upgraded to a very nice Primaris model, and as expected, his rules have got just a little bit more beefy as a result. In the background, Varo Tigurius has always been aloof and aloft from his other battle brothers and even other librarians. Uniquely amongst them, he has precognitive ability to see events before they come to pass. He has predicted orc wars and how to head them off before they happen, and he has managed to tap into the hive mind to understand the movement of the alien Tyranids, which it's reported that no other human psyker has ever been able to do. He's arguably one of the strongest psykers available to the Imperium of Man, and is appropriately a potent force on the tabletop. Chief Librarian Tigurius is an Ultramarines HQ choice, and he'll cost you 130 points to field. His stat line has got significantly beefier since he crossed the Rubicon Primaris. His movement is 6, weapon skill and ballistic skill of 3 up, strength and toughness 4, 5 wounds now, 4 attacks, leadership 9 and a 3 up save. He is armed with a bolt pistol, the Rod of Tigurius, frag grenades and crack grenades. The Rod of Tigurius is a melee weapon with a strength of +3, so typically strength 7, AP -3, which is a big upgrade on his previous Codex form, and damage of D3. So with those 4 attacks and 5 with shock assault, he'll be hitting pretty hard in close combat. He knows 3 psychic powers. You can either choose Smite and 3 powers from the Librarius discipline, or Smite and 3 psychic powers from the Indomitus discipline, the Ultramarine specific one. He can cast 2 powers per turn, and he can cast them well, as we'll see in a second, and he can also deny 2 powers per turn in the opponent's psychic phase. In terms of special rules, he has the Angels of Death special rule, which mainly gives him access to that shock assault rule, but potentially if you ever wind up in the assault doctrine, then that could help out its melee prowess even more. He has a Hood of Hellfire, his augmented psychic hood, which allows you to add 1 to cast and deny rolls, and there's no range limitation on it unlike the regular psychic hood. And he can also re-roll any psychic test for him, so he can re-roll failed tests and give himself an incredibly high chance of casting in addition to that +1 to cast. With the 2 effects combined, it means he will cast even Warp Charge 7 powers 92% of the time, which is just ridiculously reliable. So basically, if you're choosing him in your army, you can be pretty certain that the powers are going to go off the vast majority of the time. Obviously, for any lower Warp Charge casting values, it gets even higher. And finally, he has the Master of Prescience rule, which means that at the start of the battle round, you can select one friendly Ultramarines unit within 6 inches of Tigurius, and until the end of the battle round, your opponent must subtract 1 from hit rolls made against that unit, whether they are ranged attacks or close combat attacks. Now this rule is just incredibly strong. People are making quite a bit of fuss about the Salamander's Fire Shield psychic power, which gives essentially the same effect of -1 to hit. But this goes off at the start of the battle round, so you can use it even if your opponent goes first, and you don't need a psychic test to cast it, which means you have no option to fail the psychic test, or for your opponent to deny it. Now this rule is going to be best applied to whatever unit your opponent is going to be wanting to shoot next, so it's up to you to try and judge what that will be. It's best applied to one lone, really big, strong, tough unit in the centre of your army that your opponent is going to struggle to ignore, and will feel compelled to shoot through that -1 to hit nerf to try and kill it anyway. You could put it on a Repulsor Executioner, for example, or a Relic Leviathan Dreadnought, or perhaps a big squad of Ultramarines, Aggressors or Centurions. All of these units can do horrendous amounts of damage if left unchecked, so are prime candidates for this power. The good thing about this power is, though, that even if that unit does die at some point in the battle, you can just move and put it on the next best unit. So this really should be a thorn in your opponent's side all game long. So overall, Chief Librarian Tigurius is a upgraded Primaris Librarian. He will likely get 2 psychic powers off very reliably each turn, provide very decent psychic denial, help protect 1 unit from incoming fire with Master of Prescience, and if close combat catches up with him, he's not too bad on a scrap either. So you get a lot of utility for your 130 points that you've invested. The main choice you have with Tigurius is what psychic powers to select for him. The Ultramarines discipline has some decent spells, and there's certainly an element of tailoring you can do to your opponent's list. Scryer's Gaze is an excellent choice for Tigurius. It's Warp Charge 7, and if you pass the psychic test, which you have a 92% chance of doing as we discussed, then you can either add a bonus command point or use it to re-roll a hit, wound or damage roll for a friendly Ultramarine unit within 18 inches. Both results are decent buffs. Command points are the lifeblood of Space Marine armies. They now have a whole host of really good stratagems to use, and getting an extra 3 or 4 over the course of the battle could really impact the game at the later stages. Alternatively, a few extra reroll to wounds on las cannons nearby is never a bad thing either. Storm of the Emperor's Wrath is a Warp Charge 6 power that could be good to pick up against hordes. Basically roll a d6 for every model in the unit, and for every 6 they take a mortal wound. So it's best against big units such as Orc Boys, where you might be picking up 5 per turn if you target a 30-man unit. Psychic Shackles could also be a good pick on occasion. This one's Warp Charge 6, and you could use it to hamper your opponent's movement, particularly if they have a big slow-moving, heavy-hitting unit that's going to be wanting to charge you. You could potentially stand just within 18 inches of the unit, and hopefully make sure that they can't charge you next turn. Out of the Librarius discipline, I'd certainly be interested in Might of Heroes, which could be used to add +1 to the strength, toughness and attacks characteristics of a nearby friendly Ultramarines model. You could use this to buff up a very fighty character such as Calgar or Gilliman to even more insane levels of strength, or alternatively you could put it on a vehicle to make them tougher. Say for example if you had a Repulsed Executioner nearby, you could make it toughness 9, and also put the -1 to hits from his Prescience ability, so that thing is incredibly hard to remove indeed. Null Zone is another very, very powerful option, particularly against things like demons. If those demons get too close to Tigurius, and he manages to cast this, then they can say goodbye to their invulnerable saves. Basically the choice of the two disciplines is kind of up to you, and I think it will be situational depending on your opponent, which powers you choose to take for the game. As a fallback, Smite's never a bad option, and throwing out a bunch of mortal wounds all game long can certainly do you no harm. Unless he perils, of course, in which case it might a bit. Tigurius is better with perils though, because he's got quite a lot of wounds. In terms of synergies with other units, Tigurius could be protected by those very nice Victrix guards that we talked about last week. If some damage goes through from a sniper, then on a 2-up they could throw themselves in the way and take the damage for him. He'd be quite good as part of an Ultramarine character bubble, throwing out those buffs to the nearby units, providing some psychic denial, maybe taking advantage of other support characters nearby, such as Apothecaries to heal him if and when he perils, and being protected from melee by proximity of the other scary Ultramarines commanders you have around. In terms of options with stratagems, there's certainly a few you could use on him. As with any moderately fighty character, you could use Honour the Chapter to fight again, or Only in Death Does Duty End to fight when he dies, if it will make the difference between killing or not killing an important target. As with any Primaris Space Marine, you can also use Gene-Wrought Might to buff up his combat damage in the fight phase a little, though there are likely better targets of this, and Transhuman Physiology is an option for if you need any infantry unit to survive at all costs, though it is pricey. So how would I field Tigurius on the battlefield myself? I'd personally want him to be safely protected behind my main battle line, potentially amid a lot of other characters that can buff units. Ideally, Tigurius wants to be hanging out near the big threatening units in your army, so he can make them -1 to hit with his prescience. These are the things that we mentioned before: Leviathan Dreadnoughts, Repulsor Executioners, Aggressor Squads, which are just amazing with Ultramarines, Centurions, or even a whole bunch of Intercessors advancing forwards, are all pretty decent targets of -1 to hit. In just a random take all comers matchup, I think I'd usually select the Indomitus discipline, and just churn out Scryer's Gaze every single turn for an additional command point, or perhaps a reroll if I'd already regenerated a command point via other means in the battle round. Having up to 5 extra command points in a battle is pretty amazing, and is certainly not a bad use of one of his casts. With the other cast, I'd be most tempted just to smite away at the enemy, and see how many mortal wounds we can inflict as the gun line walks up. That being said, I think that Might of Heroes is a really strong pick from the Librarius discipline, and that's a strong contender as well, even if it's just making a key vehicle a lot tougher and harder for the opponent to take out. So having said that, we want to start him behind the main battle line that we're buffing, moving up to support them and keeping within 6 inches of them, if at all possible not exposing himself to enemy sniper fire or getting him in any sort of position where he could be charged. By keeping him as far forwards and central as is safe, we should be able to smite each turn as well as generating that command point and positioning him better to be able to deny any of the enemy's spells with that very nice buffed denial power. If the gun line is starting to get overwhelmed, he'd certainly have the possibility of charging a counter-attack. That's Rod of Tigurius. It's a very decent close combat weapon, and while I wouldn't go throwing him at anything too nasty or too durable, he is more than capable of offing a few enemy elite infantry as part of a greater charge. So overall, you have to balance the risk of sending him forwards to support the troops with the risk that he might get taken out. If you are too worried about this, then it's certainly not too bad just sitting back at the very back of a gun line, making your biggest, scariest units -1 to hit, and also churning out a command point each turn. Overall, I think that Tigurius is a very strong Ultramarines character, and is certainly in contention with the others when it comes to HQ selection. You really do get some decent value for your points investment with him. His main competitor are other Librarians and Primaris Librarians, which can do the same job, but just not quite as reliably. It's your choice whether the boosted toughness, melee profile, -1 to hit autocast, and boosted casting and denial is worth the extra around 50 points. I typically say that it probably is, but you might just want a cheaper unit that can roughly do the same job, and to invest those 50 points in other places in your army. So I think it's still perfectly viable to run a cheaper Librarian if that better fits in with your plans. Overall, I really like him. I think they've done well with the rules, and I'm sure you'll see him in competitive Ultramarines armies going forward. Thanks very much for listening again, and if you have any thoughts on Tigurius' use, please let me know down in the comments. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and to support me on Patreon if you're finding these videos useful. Later in the week we're planning a look at the Astrius, the enormous Forge World Primaris tank, which is going to be an interesting video to make, and I'm looking forward to it a lot. Again, thanks very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next video.